from its heyday. It's a highly complex matter. There were political matters, there was the perfidy of some of the episcopate, and a whole range of other matters that, I think it's far too complex for us to address in one sitting like today. I want to talk about John Nayland Molony. And I'm working mainly from his memories, not from mine. I'm working from the first 2 volumes of his autobiography, which I've enjoyed reading greatly. I went up to Ballarat in 2002 to run a 2-year program towards a diocesan assembly for the renewal of the diocese. And the Bishop Peter Connors had me working with every group that had any involvement in the diocese. It was a huge process of consultation leading up to an assembly which came together on a Friday night in a school gymnasium in Ballarat with no agenda. There was no top-down agenda. The agenda, as I facilitated it and demanded almost with Peter Connors' compliance, the agenda came up from the floor of the assembly. And that agenda is still in action out in the Diocese of Ballarat under its new bishop. But the thing I want to remember here is my contact with the clergy of that diocese. I was using, to start conversations, a very simple 3-question kind of model. And the first question was, what's your strongest memory of being Catholic in this diocese? And to a man, the unanimity was just absolutely startling. It was their memories of being members of and chaplains to the YCW. Every one of them, not a single dissenting voice, thought it was their strongest memory of their time in that diocese. And for them, it was more than just a thinking system to form young people. It was in fact a way of life. And for a great number of those clergy, and for a great number of people like Frank Sheehan and others who in fact became involved in that movement in that particular territory, it still is a way of life. And I think that to me is the great benefit of the YCW. I always used to worry about what happens to these people when they get too old or they start to have families and move away from the YCW. Where do they go to? What's next for them? And I think the point was made earlier. What's next is the way they live their lives and the way they influence society. You take people like Billy Scales and people like that who've gone into very influential positions in society. See, judge and act is sitting behind their ears, and it will never leave their ears in my perspective. I use this photo just by the way because it reminds me so much of the intensity on the face of one of my favourite pictures of Cardijn. I think one of the key influences on the Ballarat diocese were John Nayland Molony. I think in his time in that diocese, from the time he came back from Rome in 1954 until the time he left and was laicized in 1965, were hugely significant in that particular diocese, and the way the YCW developed up there. And it's that relationship with the National Catholic Rural Movement, which Kevin Peoples will tell you about, and I don't want to go into. But it's also Molony's fading relationship with the Santa Maria movement and philosophy. And there are a lot of influences on that as well. So, John Nayland Molony, that's him in 1922, aged 2 years. It's off the front of his first volume of his autobiography. God, we don't need that. Thank you very much. I don't need to be connected to the internet. Okay, born in 1927 in St Kilda of Mick Molony and Janie McInerney. And Janie's mother's maiden name was Naylon, N-E-Y-L-O-N, and that's where the John Nayland Molony comes from. It's an old Irish tradition of giving a second name, second sort of Christian name, to a child to honour another branch of the family. It's a very interesting old tradition. They were farmers out in the Mallee. It's a place called Sea Lake, about 240 miles from Melbourne. And in 1935, depression, low commodity prices, drought, forced them off the land, and they came in here to Melbourne. And Mick took a job as a truck driver for the Australian Petroleum Company, Alba Petroleum. Not in my memory, I can't remember Alba Petroleum. Can anybody else? They lived around Melbourne a bit. They settled in Williamstown for a while, and then after a while they moved out into Western Victoria, where Mick and Janie ran a pub for some years and farmed a couple of little properties. But by that time, John Nayland Molony was well and truly in Rome. So he went to boarding school at St Patrick's, Ballarat, and he claims that there he made friends that have been lifelong. And as he says in his autobiography, they've even superseded death. The friendship is something that's lasted for all those years. So he entered Corpus Christi College in 1945 at the tender age of 17 to begin his training for the priesthood for the Diocese of Ballarat. 2 years later, his bishop, Bishop O'Collins, sent him to Propaganda Fide to complete his studies, and O'Collins's view was that he wanted him particularly to study canon law. Bishops have a penchant for sending priests to Rome to study canon law. They figure it's protection against something or other, and it really hasn't worked all that well. He travelled by ship to Rome and arrived there on October the 5th, and there were a couple of other guys with him at that stage. A fellow called Bede Heather, who taught me Greek in Springwood in New South. I'm a New South Welshman, by the way. I'm terribly sorry about that. I can't. It was an accident of birth, I promise you. Bede Heather taught me Greek in the seminary, and then became, of course, as you know, later the Bishop of Parramatta. And now is on a roving ministry out of a caravan up the central coast of New South Wales since his resignation. Great man. The other guy who went with him on the ship was a little-known cleric called Frank Little. Anyway, they arrived in Rome on October the 5th, 1947. And John Nayland Molony was ordained in Rome on December the 21st, 1950. And the next day he celebrated his first Mass with Frank Little alongside him. He spent a further 2 years in Rome studying canon law and theology before he came home in 1954. It was a great class for bishops, that one. Frank Little, Len Faulkner, Bede Heather, and a couple of other bishops who are not known to me were all in that class. It was an absolutely magnificent class for the episcopate. But, you know, they had to become Roman before they could become bishops. This guy, who I knew well, was a very close friend of John Molony's. Jeff Lloyd became diocesan director of the YCW in my old diocese, Canberra and Goulburn. And he had been, like Molony, caught up with the Cardijn movement as it became very strong in Europe when they were studying at Prop. So that's the cover of his second volume by Wendouree, and it starts really when he comes back to Ballarat and is an assistant priest at the cathedral and diocesan director of Catholic Action Youth Movements and chaplain to the YCW. And he records in By Wendouree his special love for this particular work. As we know, from 1965 onward, he became laicized, he married, did his MA and PhD, and became one of the most prestigious historians in the Australian university sector. So, what were the key influences? I just want to concentrate on this, just a few of his key influences that brought him to the YCW and to become such a tragic for the YCW. The first one, and it's been mentioned before, was Charlie Mayne. Oh God, that thing again. We don't have a Charlie Mayne these days, and God help us, more's the pity for it. He was one of the great promoters of the Laity. If you go to the Mannix Library attached to CTC and just go into the search engine and look for Laity and go through every book that you find, 90% of them will have Charlie Mayne's ownership stamp on the inside cover. Incredible legacy that he left to the seminary, and I suspect that those books are very rarely touched. But Charlie Mayne was a huge influence, as Molony writes in his own autobiography. Charlie Mayne had the most decisive priestly influence on my life. And I think that's an extraordinary thing for anybody to say about anybody, but we do not have a Charlie Mayne in the seminary structures. I teach here in this seminary, which is the Religious Orders Seminary, and I'm a poor substitute for Charlie Mayne, let me tell you. The second big influence on him is given to his pastoral work among the poor. After he was ordained, he worked in the Diocese of Rome, mostly out in poor country areas around the diocese. And certainly in 1951, he worked here in the parish of Agro Romano. And he used to be picked up and driven there on Saturdays by a young man in an old truck. And they'd go out into Agro Romano. And the guy that used to drive him was a guy called Lello Alberici, who was a member of the Italian Catholic Action Movement. And we've heard a little bit about the Italian Catholic Action Movement today. So he's working in a very poor parish. The big influence, though, is when he in fact came in contact with the refugees and the displaced people living under the aqueduct arches around this place called Quadraro. And it's there that many think that he learnt the meaning of compassion and the will to do something about it. And as he writes himself in his autobiography, the main thing that distressed me in the early days of my priesthood was not sin, but poverty. And that's an experience we don't get too many. I am a great believer in immersion experiences in where the real people live. And we do not get those sorts of experiences in training these days. The third element in his development was the World Congress of the Lay Apostolate in 1951. You saw a shipload of people heading off, no women, I'm sorry. And the interesting thing was that Molony and another guy called George Gallen, who taught me canon law at Manly in Sydney, were the two official Australian delegates to that conference. And Molony records, nobody seemed, amazed that I was not a layman, and yet here he was, an official delegate to a lay conference. And it was here really that he records learning what the role of the laity was about, the core role of the laity, and as he records, and I quote, "Yet for lay people to undertake their own apostolate in the world, they needed formation. The only method of formation I could propose was that of the proven one called See, Judge and Act, developed by Joseph Cardijn in Belgium." Now remember that Molony is coming out of an era when Catholic action was being replaced by the term lay apostolate. Because Catholic action was seen as a participation in the apostolate of the hierarchy. Lay people didn't have their own apostolate. So we're coming out of an era when Cardijn et al. Are starting to bridge this gap between Catholic action as a participation in the hierarchy's apostolate and the very fact that the Simmons approach that if we have a mission, an apostolate, it's given to us by what Simmons called the quasi-ordination of baptism and confirmation, which was the best language he could use at the time. It's still clerical, but it's not bad. In any case, Molony also, from this Congress, starts to read people like Henri Gaudin, who wrote this marvellous book in French on the de-Christianisation of the working class in French cities in Paris in 1943. And Molony records, after reading this stuff and being at the Congress, that he forms a determination to plant the seeds of a church fit and ready to change the world. I think that's still an unfulfilled dream. Oh God, here it goes again. The next element in his development was working with the English YCW. So these are actually Irish YCW full-time workers, but I couldn't find a picture of the English ones.
The English are probably Irish too.
The national chaplain was a guy called Ted Mitchinson, who you'll find writes the preface to the English version of Layman into Action. And his contact with Ted and the full-time workers, this is where Molony gets out into the industrial areas with the full-timers. And he actually learns about see, judge and act being applied in action. And this has a huge impact on him, huge impact. And particularly his relationship with Ted Mitchinson. He also in this time meets one Patrick Keegan, who of course is legendary in the YCW. He also went to an international congress, a small international congress in Holland at this time. And he records there being impressed with the breadth of the Joseph's movement. On the way back from that by ship, because he couldn't afford the airfare, he records the story of the hat that he is sort of characterised by in his later life. It was after that sea trip that he bought the hat for a very significant and practical reason that you don't want to hear about before lunch. It records somebody being very ill on the deck above him as he was sitting below and reading. The other and huge influence on him, I think, is meeting the man himself. You can't replace that. My wife Judy had met Cardijn and still lives on that memory to a very great extent. But you meet this charismatic man, and Keegan and Cardijn were in Rome in late �52 trying to convince the Cardinalate of the worth of their movement. So it's how can I put it? It's an extraordinary life journey that this man in fact engaged with. But there were other influences as well. He worked in the industrial areas of Genoa in '51. He was exposed to the worker priest movement in Paris in 1952. He met Justin Simmons in Europe in 1953. Simmons was there with a pilgrimage from Melbourne to Europe in that year. And he met Vincent Chiese of Fides Press, the legendary Fides Press that used to publish anything that came out of the YCW. And we don't have that anymore either. We don't have